In the year 5500 before Christ, the southern plains of Mesopotamia began to awaken. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the rivers fanned into countless streams and marshes, a fragile new world was taking shape. Floodwaters rose and fell, spreading mud across the lowlands, carving channels, and leaving behind rich soil. To some, it was destruction. To others, it was opportunity. Here, in this shifting and unpredictable land, the first steps of civilization would be taken. At first, the land was dotted with small communities. Families built huts of reeds lashed together with ropes of palm fiber. Smoke from their hearths curled into the sky. Children played near the water's edge, chasing fish with woven baskets. The adults tended tiny fields, scraping furrows into the soil with simple tools. The rivers were both friends and enemies. They gave water, fish, and fertile mud. But they also drowned crops, collapsed huts, and swept lives away in sudden floods. To live here was to gamble with nature every season. The people slowly learned to turn chaos into order. They dug ditches by hand, channeling water into their fields. They raised embankments, building barriers of earth against the floods. With every passing generation, canals stretched farther, weaving like veins across the land. Irrigation became the key to life, transforming the plain into a patchwork of fields where barley grew tall and green. For the first time, harvests were reliable. For the first time, a people could remain in one place. The rhythm of the year became the rhythm of survival. Spring brought floods, sometimes feared, sometimes welcomed. Summer scorched the land with relentless heat, demanding endless work in the fields and canals. Autumn brought harvest, the great moment of reward, when barley was cut with flint sickles and bundled into sheaves. Winter cooled the air, and families gathered close in their homes, telling stories, repairing tools, and preparing for the cycle to begin again. Life was measured not in days, but in seasons, and each season carried both hope and danger. As villages grew, the houses of reeds were replaced by mud brick. The mud, shaped into bricks and dried beneath the blazing sun, hardened into walls. Walls to protect from wind. Walls to hold warmth at night. Walls to endure. With brick came permanence. Homes could stand for generations. Families could anchor themselves, not just to a season, but to a place. And at the center of each village, something larger rose. A shrine. A temple. At first small, little more than a raised platform with offerings of grain or fish. But with time, the temples grew. They became the tallest buildings of the community, towers of mud brick layered one upon the other, reaching upward toward the sky. The temple was not only for the gods, it was the storehouse for grain, the hall for gatherings, the heart of administration. To build for the gods was also to build for society itself. By the 4th millennium before Christ, the southern plain was no longer a land of villages. It was a land of cities. Eridu, perhaps the first of all, was revered as the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. Its layers reveal shrine after shrine, each built atop the last, century upon century, as if its people could never cease striving higher. Uruk rose even greater. Its walls, said to be built by the legendary Gilgamesh, stretched for miles. Inside them lived tens of thousands of people, the largest concentration of human life the world had yet seen. The streets bustled with merchants and craftsmen. Kilns fired pots and bricks. Looms produced cloth. Breweries filled jars with thick, nourishing beer. Temples, vast and complex, rose above the city, their courtyards alive with offerings and chants. From a distance, Uruk appeared as an island of towers floating above the flat plain, its ziggurats shimmering in the sun. Life in the city demanded new ways of thinking. No longer could each family live by its own rhythm. Canals had to be managed, fields measured, harvests recorded. The temple priests took on these tasks, overseeing work crews, organizing storage, and keeping accounts. Clay tokens were pressed into tablets, representing sheep, grain, and oil. In time, these marks grew into symbols. Symbols into words. Words into writing. The first writing was not poetry, nor stories, but numbers. Records of offerings, lists of goods, tallies of rations. Yet within those numbers lay the seed of literature, law, and history. For the first time, knowledge could outlive memory. A scribe could impress a tablet with signs, and long after he was gone, another could read his thoughts. The clay spoke across generations. Religion was the fabric of life. Each city belonged to a god. Uruk was devoted to Inanna, radiant goddess of love and war, whose temple Iana glittered with beauty. Eridu worshipped Enki, the keeper of the fresh waters beneath the earth, whose wisdom guided humanity. Nippur honored Enlil, the lord of air and destiny, whose decrees shaped the fate of kings. Life was a constant negotiation with these divine powers. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals punctuated the year. The gods were never absent. Their presence felt in every harvest, every birth, every flood. With prosperity came hierarchy. At first, leaders were chosen to guide labor, to mediate disputes, to stand as servants of the gods. These leaders, called Ensi, claimed authority through divine sanction. Over time, their role deepened. The Ensi became kings. Kingship was believed to have descended from heaven, and once born, it never disappeared. Yet beneath the rising power of kings lay the daily lives of thousands. Farmers rose before dawn to walk to their fields, guiding plows drawn by oxen. Women ground grain into flour, baked bread in clay ovens, brewed beer in great jars. Children learned to carry water, herd goats, and shape clay. Craftsmen worked in workshops, making tools of copper, carving seals of stone, painting pots with delicate designs. At night, families gathered in courtyards, sharing food, stories, and songs. The city was alive with human voices, each one part of the great experiment. Food was plain, but nourishing. Barley bread was the staple, eaten at nearly every meal. Beer, thick and cloudy, was drunk through long straws. Dates were gathered from palm trees, adding sweetness to the diet. Fish came from the rivers. Sheep and goats provided milk and meat. On festival days, richer meals were prepared: roasted lamb, fruits, and honey. What they ate was not only survival, but a reflection of the land itself, shaped by the rivers and the fields they tended. Clothing, too, reflected their environment. Wool from sheep was spun into cloth. Men wore simple skirts. Women draped themselves in shawls, both dyed in earthy tones or decorated with patterns. Jewelry of beads, shells, and precious stones adorned the wealthy. Hair was carefully arranged, sometimes braided, sometimes perfumed with oils. In a world made of mud, beauty still had a place. Music drifted through the streets, lyres and harps plucked, flutes played from reeds, drums beaten in rhythm. Songs praised the gods, celebrated victories, mourned the dead, and told stories of heroes. Storytelling, both sung and spoken, preserved the memory of generations. Around the fire, children listened with wide eyes as elders told of floods, of gods descending from the heavens, of rulers blessed and cursed by fate. Law, though unwritten, was understood. Theft brought punishment. Promises carried weight. Agreements were sealed with oaths before the gods. The temple judged disputes, acting as both sanctuary and court. Over time, these customs hardened into the first codes of justice. But even before words were written, the sense of order was strong. Life demanded it. The people also pondered the great questions of life and death. To them, the world was fragile, balanced between the gift of the gods and their wrath. Death was not feared, but accepted. Burials were simple, sometimes within the floor of the home, surrounded by modest offerings of food and tools. Life was brief, and fate was uncertain. What mattered was continuity: the family, the community, the service to the gods. The afterlife was shadowy and silent, but memory endured in the living, and in the clay tablets pressed by the hands of scribes. The land was harsh, and yet it inspired greatness. The endless flat horizon, the marshes alive with reeds and birds, the rivers glinting in the sun, all seemed both fragile and eternal. In this landscape, humanity dared to build something lasting. Cities from clay, writing from symbols, kingship from faith. And so, from mud to temples, the people of Sumer stepped into history. What began as huts of reeds became the first cities. What began as tokens of trade became the first writing. What began as fear of the rivers became mastery over water. Here, in the land between the rivers, the story of civilization truly began. In the centuries after 2900 before Christ, the land of Sumer entered a new age. Villages had become towns, and towns had become cities. Across the southern plains, the skyline was marked by temples and walls, each city rising like an island above the endless horizon of fields and marshes. The people of Sumer were no longer scattered farmers. They were citizens of powerful city-states, each proud, each ambitious, each devoted to its own god. Uruk stood as a giant, its temples gleaming in the sun, its markets alive with voices. Ur flourished by the sea, sending boats across the waters of the Persian Gulf. Lagash, Umma, Kish, and dozens more dotted the land, each with its own ruler, its own priesthood, its own destiny. No two were alike, yet all were bound by the same culture, the same writing, the same gods. Life in these cities had grown complex. Narrow streets wound between mud-brick houses. Workshops clattered with the sound of copper being hammered into tools, of potters shaping clay, of looms weaving wool into cloth. Marketplaces were alive with trade: jars of oil, baskets of dates, rolls of cloth, herds of goats, fish from the rivers, and exotic goods brought from afar, timber from the mountains, stones for carving, and lapis lazuli glowing deep blue, carried from distant Afghanistan. Merchants traveled along the rivers and canals, their boats heavy with cargo, their seals pressed into clay tablets to record every transaction. The temple still stood at the heart of each city. It was more than a place of worship. It was a center of power. Priests managed land, supervised workers, and organized trade. Farmers brought a portion of their harvest to the temple storehouses. Shepherds delivered wool, fishermen their catch. In return, the temple fed laborers, provided offerings for the gods, and redistributed goods. Religion and economy were one, but with prosperity came rivalry. Fields needed water, and canals did not stop at city borders. When one city diverted water, another suffered. Farmers quarreled, and their rulers took up arms. The rivers that once united the land now became lines of conflict. Disputes that began with water rights ended in war. And so, the first battles of recorded history were fought. City-states built armies of spearmen, archers, and chariots drawn by onagers, wild donkeys tamed for war. Soldiers marched behind banners that carried the emblems of their gods. When they fought, it was not only for land and water, but for divine honor. Victory was proof of divine favor, defeat a sign of anger from the heavens. The king of Lagash once inscribed his triumph over Umma on a great stele of stone, known today as the Stele of the Vultures. It shows soldiers advancing in tight formation, spears lowered, trampling their enemies. Above them, the god Ningirsu himself appears, holding captives in a great net. For the Sumerians, war was not just a struggle of men, but a contest between gods. Despite the wars, culture flourished. Writing spread beyond temple accounts into royal inscriptions, hymns, and prayers. Scribes carefully pressed their reed stylus into clay, line by line, sign by sign. Each tablet carried the weight of permanence. The world of thought expanded, and with it, the memory of kings and deeds. Daily life continued in the shadow of temples and walls. Farmers tended barley and wheat, pulled plows with oxen, and carried water in heavy jars. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and cared for children. Craftsmen polished stone into cylinder seals, each engraved with intricate designs that told stories in miniature. These seals were pressed into clay, marking ownership, sealing jars, and authenticating documents. They were tiny works of art, carried on cords around the neck. Festivals brought moments of joy. The city gathered in celebration of its patron god or goddess. Musicians played lyres and drums, dancers moved in circles, and priests led processions. Offerings of animals and food were brought to the temple, smoke rising from altars into the air. The gods were honored with song, with dance, with sacrifice. In those moments, the city felt united, bound together in devotion and in shared hope for fertility, prosperity, and protection. The Sumerians believed that their gods lived in the temples, cared for by priests as if they were royal guests. Statues of the gods were clothed, fed, and adorned with jewelry. To serve the gods was to ensure the survival of the city itself. To neglect them was to invite disaster. Beneath this devotion, inequality grew. The Ensi, the city ruler, claimed authority not only as steward of the gods, but as king in his own right. Palaces rose alongside temples. Armies answered to rulers as much as to priests. The common people bore the weight of taxes and labor, while the elite lived in larger homes, wore finer clothes, and dined on richer foods. Yet all were bound together by a single truth. Without unity, the city could not stand. The cycle of life was marked by labor and ritual. Men worked the fields, women spun wool and prepared meals, children learned trades from their parents. At night, families gathered in their courtyards, sharing bread and beer by the light of oil lamps. The stars shone brilliantly in the clear Mesopotamian sky, and many wondered if the gods themselves dwelt among those distant lights. The priests studied the heavens, marking the movements of stars and planets, seeking signs of the gods' will. Out of these observations, astronomy was born. The age of city-states was one of both cooperation and conflict. Each city was a world unto itself, proud and independent, yet vulnerable. Alone, they could rise, but alone, they could also fall. Over the centuries, alliances shifted, wars erupted, and rulers rose and fell. Yet through it all, the culture of Sumer endured. It was an age of invention, of art, of ambition. It was an age of rivalry, of war, of devotion. The Sumerian city-state was both a miracle and a fragile experiment, balancing prosperity and peril on the shifting waters of the rivers. And so, in this age of war, trade, and worship, humanity continued its great journey. Cities grew taller, writing grew deeper. Gods grew nearer. Out of clay and faith, the foundations of civilization were set. In the land of Sumer, the world was never silent. The voices of the gods whispered in the wind, shimmered in the stars, and rumbled in the floods of the rivers. Every stone, every reed, every breeze carried a meaning. Life was fragile, short, and uncertain. But in myth, the Sumerians found explanations, order, and purpose. Their stories were not only tales for entertainment. They were the foundation of their existence, guiding kings, shaping rituals, and giving comfort in the face of mortality. The pantheon of Sumer was vast and alive. At its heart were the great gods, each commanding a domain of nature and destiny. An, the father of heaven, distant and powerful. Enlil, the god of air and storms, who held the tablets of destiny, decreeing the fate of all things. Enki, the lord of the deep waters, clever and cunning, the giver of wisdom. Inanna, radiant goddess of love and war, whose passions could raise kingdoms or destroy them. Nanna, the moon, keeper of time and tides. Utu, the sun, bringer of justice. To the Sumerians, the world was crowded with divinity, and every aspect of existence reflected the will of unseen powers. The myths explain the mysteries of the universe. In the beginning, they said, heaven and earth were one. The primeval sea, called Namu, gave birth to them both. Out of this watery chaos came the gods, who shaped the land, raised the heavens, and filled the earth with life. Humanity, according to their stories, was created not as masters, but as servants, to feed the gods, to build their temples, to maintain the order of the world. To live was to serve. To serve was to survive. One of their most powerful stories told of Inanna's descent into the underworld. The goddess of love and fertility, adorned with jewels and robes of power, decided to visit the land of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she was stripped of her garments, her crown, her jewelry, until she entered naked and powerless. There she was judged, struck down, and hung upon a hook. The world above withered in her absence. Crops failed, animals ceased to breed, love vanished. Only through the intervention of Enki was she revived and allowed to return. Yet even then, a bargain had to be made. Another must take her place. Thus her husband Dumuzi was condemned to spend half the year below, while Inanna reigned above, marking the seasons of fertility and barrenness. This myth was more than a story. It was an explanation for the cycle of life and death, for the turning of seasons, for the inescapable presence of mortality. It told the people that even gods could die, and that life was always balanced by loss. Another tale spoke of Enki and the creation of humanity. When the lesser gods grew weary of labor, digging canals, raising embankments, tending fields, they complained to the greater gods. And so, Enki, with the goddess Ninhursag, fashioned mankind from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god. Humanity was created to work, to serve, to relieve the gods of toil. This story explained both the gift of life and its burden. For the Sumerians, existence was not a privilege, but a duty. But the greatest story of all was that of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, half god and half man. Gilgamesh was mighty, restless, and unyielding. He built the walls of Uruk, he sought out adventures, and he defied the order of the world. With his companion Enkidu, a wild man shaped from clay, he slew monsters, defied gods, and carved his name into the memory of humankind. Yet when Enkidu died, struck down by illness as punishment from the heavens, Gilgamesh discovered the truth that no strength, no courage, no glory could escape. Death waits for all. Driven by grief, he wandered the earth, seeking immortality. He crossed seas, faced trials, and finally reached Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, the man who had been granted eternal life by the gods. But even here, Gilgamesh found no escape. Immortality was not for mortals. In the end, he returned to Uruk to gaze upon its walls. His comfort was not eternal life, but the city he had built, the legacy that would endure after him. This epic, the oldest story known to humankind, carried the deepest meaning. It taught that life is short and death is certain. What remains is memory, legacy, the works we leave behind. In the voice of Gilgamesh, the people of Sumer heard their own fear, their own longing, their own hope for permanence. The underworld itself was not a place of torment, nor of reward. It was a shadowy realm beneath the earth, where the dead lived as shades, eating dust, drinking from muddy pools. All, whether king or peasant, shared this fate. The Sumerians did not promise paradise, nor threaten eternal fire. Instead, they taught that the only immortality was the memory held by the living, the names inscribed on clay, the walls raised in stone. Rituals of burial reflected this belief. The dead were often laid beneath the floors of their homes, surrounded by simple offerings, jars of beer, bowls of grain, small tools, amulets to protect them in the shadows. In royal tombs, greater treasures were buried: golden cups, lyres inlaid with lapis lazuli, servants sacrificed to accompany their masters. But whether grand or humble, all returned to the same fate: the silence of the underworld. The Sumerians looked at the heavens and saw reflections of their myths. The sun, Utu, rode across the sky each day, bringing justice and light. The moon, Nana, measured the months, guiding the cycle of festivals. The stars were divine signs, their movements studied by priests, their patterns carrying omens. The sky was a tablet, written upon by the gods themselves, revealing fragments of destiny to those wise enough to read them. Music and prayer brought these myths to life. Hymns to Inanna, chants to Enlil, laments for the dead, and songs of victory echoed through the temples. Priests recited long lists of divine names, each syllable a step closer to the sacred. Ordinary people, too, whispered prayers. before planting, before journeys, before childbirth. Every act was bound to myth, every breath tied to the will of the gods. Through these stories, the Sumerians explained the meaning of existence. They lived in a world of uncertainty, floods, droughts, famine, and war. But myth gave them structure, purpose, and hope. It told them why they labored, why they suffered, why they loved, and why they died. It reminded them that even gods were vulnerable, that death was universal, and that only through memory and legacy could one endure. And so, in the quiet of the night, under the endless Mesopotamian sky, the people of Sumer looked to the heavens and listened. The stars were not silent. The gods were not absent. Life was brief, but it was woven into a greater story. A story of clay and blood, of gods and men, of death and remembrance. A story that still speaks to us across 5,000 years of time. In the centuries after 2400 before Christ, the city-states of Sumer reached both their height and their breaking point. For centuries they had fought, traded, worshipped, and thrived, each bound to its patron god, each jealous of its power. Yet the very rivalries that gave them strength also weakened them. Water disputes turned into wars. Ambition turned into conquest. And soon, one man sought to bring all of Sumer beneath a single crown. His name was Lugalzagesi, ruler of Umma. He rose from a city long overshadowed by its rivals, a land scarred by endless conflict with Lagash over the fertile fields and canals that lay between them. For generations, the people of Umma had looked across those fields with envy, while Lagash boasted of its victories, carving its triumphs into stone. But Lugalzagesi would change the story. He was not content to rule a small city. He dreamed of dominion. He began by subduing Lagash itself, overturning its power and humbling its rulers. Then, step by step, he extended his reach, forging alliances, defeating rivals, and gathering the scattered cities of Sumer under his banner. From the southern marshes to the northern plains, he declared himself king of the land. His inscriptions boasted that he was chosen by Enlil, the great god of air and storms, to bring order to Sumer. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though unity had been achieved. But Lugalzagesi's power was fragile. His dominion was built on war, and war always invites challengers. Far to the north, beyond the traditional cities of Sumer, another power was rising. A people who spoke the Akkadian tongue, related yet distinct from the Sumerians, had long lived in Mesopotamia, blending into its culture, serving in its cities, but also keeping their own identity. Among them was a man whose story would become legend. He was known as Sargon of Akkad. His beginnings, as the tales tell, were humble. Some said he was the son of a gardener, others that he was born of a priestess and set adrift in a basket upon the river, rescued and raised by strangers. An echo of stories that would echo down the centuries. What is certain is that Sargon rose from obscurity to greatness. A cupbearer in the court of Kish, he mastered the arts of administration, of war, and of persuasion. Then, with boldness unmatched, he seized power. When Lugalzagesi claimed dominion over Sumer, Sargon marched against him. Their armies clashed, banners flying, spears shining in the sun. In the end, it was Sargon who triumphed. Lugalzagesi was captured, brought in chains, and paraded as a defeated king. His dreams of empire ended not in glory, but in humiliation. From this victory, Sargon built something the world had never seen before. He did not merely rule a single city. He founded a new capital, Akkad, whose exact location is lost to us today, but whose name became synonymous with power. From there, he extended his rule far beyond Sumer. His armies marched north into the lands of the Akkadians, west into Syria, east into Elam. He created the first true empire, a dominion that stretched across Mesopotamia, binding peoples of many tongues beneath one authority. The kings of Sumer had always claimed divine favor, but Sargon claimed something more. He was not only chosen by the gods, he was their instrument upon earth. His inscriptions declared that Inanna herself had granted him victory, that his conquests were the will of heaven. By linking his rule to the mightiest goddess, he elevated his kingship to a new level. Under Sargon, Akkad became a beacon of power. He established a professional army, loyal to the throne rather than to any single city. He installed governors across the conquered lands, weaving a system of administration that reached into every corner of his empire. He maintained trade routes that carried goods from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. In his reign, Mesopotamia was not merely a land of city-states, but a network of peoples, bound together by force, by tribute, and by ambition. But empires are not built without cost. Sumerian pride burned with resentment. Cities that had once ruled themselves now bowed to Akkad. Priests who had once spoken with divine authority now saw their temples overshadowed by imperial power. Rebellions flared, and Sargon spent much of his reign putting down uprisings, reminding city after city that his word was law. Yet despite this unrest, the Akkadian Empire flourished. Its scribes wrote not only in Sumerian but in Akkadian, marking the rise of a new language of power. Its art blended traditions, showing kings larger than life, trampling enemies, embraced by gods. Its influence reached beyond Mesopotamia, as far as the Levant, and perhaps even into Egypt. Sargon reigned for decades, a figure of awe and fear. When he died, his empire passed to his sons, and then to his grandson, Naram-Sin, who declared himself not merely king, but god of Akkad. The step was radical. Never before had a living man been deified in such a way. Naram-Sin's stela shows him towering above soldiers, wearing the horned crown of divinity, crushing foes beneath his feet. In his reign, the empire reached its greatest height. But such heights invite collapse. In time, enemies gathered at the edges. The Gutians, tribes from the mountains, swept down and shattered Akkad's power. The empire fractured, its glory fading into memory. The Sumerian cities, long suppressed, rose again. And yet, though Akkad fell, it had changed the world forever. The age of city-states was gone. The age of empires had begun. The idea that one man could rule not just a city, not just a land, but all lands. That idea was born in Mesopotamia, with Sargon of Akkad. For the people of Sumer, this was both a loss and a revelation. Their independence had been broken, but their culture endured. Their language, their gods, their myths continued, now intertwined with those of the Akkadians. In the mingling of Sumer and Akkad, the future of Mesopotamian civilization was forged. And so, from rivalry and ambition, from chains and conquest, A new world emerged. The first empire rose upon the rivers, casting a shadow that would linger for centuries, a legacy of power and of unity, born from the dreams of kings and the will of the gods. In the year 2112 before Christ, Sumer awoke once more from centuries of turmoil. The great empires of Akkad had risen and fallen, leaving cities scarred, canals silted, and temples abandoned. For a time, it seemed that the age of Sumer might fade forever, that its people would be scattered and forgotten. Yet from this chaos, a new dynasty emerged, the third dynasty of Ur, ushering in a renaissance of culture, power, and civilization. At the center of this renewal was Ur-Nammu, the founder of the dynasty. He was a man of vision, understanding that Sumer could thrive again only if law, religion, and labor were harmonized. He restored canals and repaired dikes, ensuring that the rivers would once more sustain life. Fields of barley and wheat stretched farther than they had for generations, while sheep and goats grazed along carefully maintained pastures. The land itself seemed to breathe with newfound order, responding to the will of men who sought to live in harmony with both earth and God. The cities of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, and Eridu rose in splendor. Mud brick homes were repaired, courtyards cleared, and streets widened. Markets buzzed with life. Farmers brought barley, flax, and dates. Artisans displayed pottery, finely carved cylinder seals, and delicate jewelry. Bread ovens glowed in the evening, sending the aroma of baking into every alley. Children ran barefoot along the canals, laughing as the sun dipped low over the horizon. Life, once fragile, flourished again. But Ur-Nammu's vision extended beyond mere survival. He sought justice. He created one of the earliest known codes of law, carefully inscribed on clay tablets. Theft, murder, and injury were punished, but contracts, marriage, and commerce were protected. The laws were designed not to terrify, but to guide. To bring fairness to a world that had often known chaos. Priests, scribes, and officials were appointed to oversee the enforcement of these laws. In this balance of power and justice, Sumer rediscovered stability. Religion was central to this renaissance. Temples were rebuilt with care and grandeur. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nana, the moon god, rose high above the city, its terraced layers gleaming in sunlight. Priests performed daily rituals, dressing statues of the gods, offering food and drink, and chanting hymns that echoed through the courtyards. Festivals marked the passing of the seasons, celebrating fertility, harvest, and the cycles of life. During these times, the entire city seemed to dance in devotion, bound together by the rhythms of faith and the shared recognition of the divine. Ur-Nammu also expanded the role of the king. No longer merely a servant of the gods or a conqueror of cities, the king became a unifying figure, a symbol of harmony between heaven and earth. Kings oversaw irrigation, trade, and construction, ensuring that every citizen, from farmer to artisan to priest, had a place in the grand design. This careful attention to administration allowed Sumer to thrive like never before. Trade extended far beyond the rivers. Merchant caravans crossed the deserts, bringing copper from the mountains, timber from the forests, and precious stones from distant lands. Boats traveled the Persian Gulf, carrying lapis lazuli, carnelian, and shells. The economy was a web of connections, linking Sumer to lands as far as Anatolia, Elam, and the Levant. The wealth of Ur filled temples and palaces alike, yet the system was built to sustain the population, not merely glorify the elite. Daily life in the Third Dynasty was vivid and structured. Farmers rose at dawn to till the fields, their hands worn by plow and hoe, but their work guided by irrigation maps and schedules. Women prepared meals of barley bread, stews of lentils and vegetables, and the ever-present beer, which nourished both body and spirit. Children learned crafts from their parents, how to spin flax, weave cloth, shape clay, and carve cylinder seals. Music, poetry, and storytelling continued to enrich daily existence. Harps and lyres were played in homes and temples alike, while priests recited myths of creation, floods, and heroic deeds, connecting each generation to the memory of the past. One of the most remarkable features of this era was the flourishing of art and literature. Sculptors carved statues of kings and gods with intricate detail. Cylinder seals were pressed into clay to mark ownership and record transactions, each a miniature masterpiece. Epic tales were written and preserved. The Epic of Gilgamesh continued to inspire scribes, reminding the people that life is fleeting, but legacy endures. Hymns, laments, and prayers were copied and recopied, each tablet a testament to devotion, skill, and memory. Yet even amid this prosperity, Sumer faced challenges. Droughts threatened crops, and floods could still destroy carefully tended fields. Rebellions occasionally flared in distant cities. The king and his officials had to maintain vigilance, balancing power with justice, enforcement with mercy. It was a delicate equilibrium, but one that defined the brilliance of Ur-Nammu's reign and the subsequent rulers of the Third Dynasty. Under Shulgi, Ur-Nammu's son, this renaissance reached its pinnacle. Shulgi reorganized the state, standardizing weights and measures, reforming the calendar, and creating an administrative network so precise that scholars centuries later would marvel at its efficiency. He declared himself a god of the state, blending kingship and divinity, and his inscriptions celebrate not just military victories, but also his role as a builder, a legislator, and a protector of the people. Temples and cities were rebuilt with grandeur. Roads connected cities, canals carried water and goods, and trade flourished. Life was long, structured, and rich with ritual. Citizens knew their roles, and yet they also participated in the shared culture that had grown over centuries. The Third Dynasty was not merely a political revival. It was a cultural, religious, and economic renaissance that reshaped Sumer and left a legacy that would influence Mesopotamia for centuries. Even in art and architecture, the vision of the Third Dynasty was evident. Ziggurats reached toward the sky, their steps terraced to symbolize the ascent to the heavens. Temples were adorned with colored bricks and inscriptions. Statues depicted humans in devotion to the gods, kings with power tempered by wisdom. Everyday objects, jars, bowls, figurines, reflected both beauty and utility, showing that even the simplest item carried meaning and care. The people of Sumer, once fragmented, now found themselves part of a coherent civilization. Life was measured by the rivers and the seasons, by festivals and labor, by prayers and offerings. Yet it was also measured by human ambition, creativity, and devotion. The Third Dynasty balanced these elements, creating a society where gods, kings, and citizens worked together in a delicate harmony. Death remained a constant presence. Yet in this Renaissance, burial practices became more elaborate. Tombs of kings were filled with treasures, inscriptions, and offerings intended to accompany them into the afterlife. Ordinary people continued to be buried beneath homes or in family plots, with food, tools, and amulets. The memory of the dead was maintained through stories, hymns, and inscriptions, ensuring that even after death, a person's life contributed to the ongoing story of Sumer. Through a combination of governance, devotion, labor, and culture, the third dynasty of Ur restored Sumer to greatness. It was an era that demonstrated the resilience of civilization. From the rivers of Mesopotamia to the walls of Ur, from the canals to the ziggurats, from the clay tablets to the harps of musicians, life flourished again in harmony with both gods and nature. And so, for nearly a century, the Sumerian Renaissance endured. The third dynasty of Ur left a legacy of law, culture, and power that would echo long after its fall. It was a testament to human resilience, to vision and planning, to the enduring ability of people to rise from chaos and rebuild a civilization that could inspire awe, even millennia later. In the year 2000 before Christ, the great cities of Sumer, which had once flourished under the third dynasty of Ur, began to feel the weight of time and change. The rivers, which had nourished their fields and sustained their lives, became unpredictable. Floods destroyed canals, silt choked irrigation systems, and the once fertile soil grew weary. Crops failed, livestock perished, and famine whispered through the streets of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. The people, who had built ziggurats reaching toward the sky, who had carved laws into clay for justice, who had sung hymns to gods and kings, now faced a world that was turning against them. The power of kings waned. The centralized authority that had once held the empire together weakened under strain. Governors grew ambitious, rebels rose, and the unity that had allowed Sumer to prosper for centuries began to fracture. And then, from the west and the north, new peoples arrived. The Amorites, semi-nomadic tribes from the deserts and plains, moved into Mesopotamia. They were not invaders in the way armies of old had been. They were migrants, seeking land, water, and opportunity. Yet their arrival unsettled the fragile cities. Amorite chieftains gained influence, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. Some married into Sumerian elites, others seized control of towns, gradually eroding the old order. The third dynasty of Ur could not withstand these pressures forever. Kings struggled to maintain irrigation, to collect taxes, to defend borders, and to keep the gods appeased. Priesthoods, once central to daily life, found themselves caught between loyalty to old rulers and the new powers rising among the Amorites. Temples fell into neglect, festivals became irregular, and the sense of divine favor, so essential to Sumerian society, began to waver. Yet life continued in the streets, fields, and homes. Farmers tilled the land, though less reliably than before. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and cared for children. Craftsmen continued to carve seals and mold pottery. Children played in the courtyards, oblivious to the slow decay of empires. Music and song, ever present, provided comfort. Harps and drums echoed softly in homes and temples, a reminder that culture endures even in times of decline. In the cities, Walls were repaired hastily, gates reinforced, but the might of Ur, Nammu, and Shulgi could no longer be restored. Trade slowed, as caravans avoided regions now unstable. Lapis lazuli and precious metals became scarce. The once bustling markets grew quieter. Merchants turned cautious, travelers wary. The rivers, fickle and unpredictable, carried both hope and danger. Floods destroyed homes, droughts threatened survival. Nature itself seemed to conspire with history, accelerating the decline. Amid this turmoil, stories of heroism and piety endured. Kings and officials still built monuments, inscribed hymns, and recorded deeds in clay. But the scale of their ambitions could not match the scale of the problems they faced. Rebellions erupted, cities fought among themselves, and the old order, carefully constructed over centuries, began to crumble. By 1850 BC, many of the great Sumerian cities were shadows of their former glory. Ur, once a radiant center of law, culture, and devotion, was diminished. Its ziggurat still stood, a reminder of past greatness. But the power that had shaped canals, trade, and temples had vanished. Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, all bore the scars of neglect and conquest. The Amorites, meanwhile, established new dynasties in many regions. Babylon would eventually rise from these changes, but for the Sumerians, it was an ending. The language, writing, and culture survived. But the political sovereignty of Sumer was gone. Independence, once the mark of every city-state, was no longer attainable. Sumer had passed from history as a dominant civilization, absorbed into the new currents of Mesopotamian power. Yet the Sumerians left a lasting legacy. Their innovations, irrigation systems, canals, ziggurats, the wheel, cuneiform writing, codified law, and complex urban society, endured. The Amorites and later civilizations inherited these foundations. Temples continued to function, cities remained inhabited, and scribes continued to write. The Sumerian spirit, embedded in culture, religion, and knowledge, was never lost. Even in decline, the people of Sumer lived meaningful lives. Farmers rose at dawn, tending stubborn fields. Women baked bread, wove cloth, and performed rituals in homes and shrines. Priests recited prayers, offering guidance to kings and commoners alike. Artisans carved symbols into clay, inscribing their memory for future generations. And above all, the gods remained present, whether in the grand temples or in the quiet corners of houses, guiding, warning, and inspiring. Death, always near, was understood with the same calm that had guided life. Burials continued, with food and tools for the afterlife. Stories of Gilgamesh, Inanna, and Enki were retold, reminding the living that life is brief, that legacy matters, and that even the greatest civilizations can fade. By 1750 BC, the cities of Sumer were shadows, yet their essence survived. The rivers, once lifeblood of empires, carried their stories downstream. Clay tablets preserved their laws, hymns, and epic tales. Temples and walls, though partially ruined, whispered of the heights that humans had reached. Civilization had faltered, but memory endured. Thus, the fall of Sumer was not the end of history, but a transformation. The people, their culture, and their knowledge became part of the broader tapestry of Mesopotamia. Empires would rise and fall, but the first civilization, the cradle of human society, had shown the world how to live, to build, to worship, and to write. Its legacy was eternal, even as its cities crumbled to dust. Even after the fall of the great Sumerian cities, the world did not forget them. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates continued their ceaseless journey, flowing through deserts and plains, carrying with them both water and memory. These waterways, lifeblood of Mesopotamia, preserve the legacy of the Sumerians, silently connecting past, present, and future. The Sumerians had been the first to write. With a reed stylus pressed into soft clay, they captured the words of kings, the rules of law, the hymns to gods, and the stories of heroes. Cuneiform was more than writing. It was a bridge across time. Even when the cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash crumbled, these tablets endured. They preserved knowledge, culture, and the collective memory of a people whose civilization had been the cradle of history. The wheel, invented by the Sumerians, continued to turn across the lands. It carried trade across deserts and rivers, transported goods from one city to another, and eventually enabled civilizations far beyond Mesopotamia to flourish. Irrigation systems, perfected over centuries of trial and labor, ensured that agriculture could sustain generations to come. These were lessons written not in books, but in canals, fields, and dikes, a silent, enduring testament to human ingenuity. Even as the Amorites and later peoples settled the plains, they were heirs to Sumer. Temples were rebuilt, often on the ruins of older structures. Ziggurats continued to rise toward the heavens. Music and song, passed down through generations, echoed in homes, streets, and sanctuaries. The gods of Sumer, Enlil, Inanna, Enki, Nana, Utu, continued to inspire devotion, even as names and rituals evolved. Myth had become immortal, traveling through the voices of priests, the hands of scribes, and the memories of ordinary people. Life after the fall of Sumer was a mixture of continuity and adaptation. Farmers worked the same fields, though now under new rulers. Families tended animals, baked bread, brewed beer, and wove cloth as they always had. Children learned trades from their parents, and the rhythms of daily life remained remarkably similar. Despite political upheaval. In courtyards and homes, life went on, the pulse of civilization beating quietly beneath the shadows of history. The Sumerians had also left behind profound knowledge of the stars. Astronomers had charted the movements of planets and constellations, linking them to religious festivals and agricultural cycles. These observations influenced not only their own society, but later civilizations, helping humanity measure time, predict seasons, and understand the heavens. The night sky, once studied by Sumerian priests, remained a source of guidance and wonder for generations. Cultural and artistic achievements endured as well. Cylinder seals continued to mark transactions and identify individuals, carrying intricate designs that told stories in miniature. Sculptors, potters, and metalworkers preserved techniques perfected over centuries. Every object, from the simplest jar to the grandest statue, bore the mark of Sumerian craftsmanship. These artifacts reminded future generations that human creativity could transcend time, and that beauty could be found even in mundane objects. The legacy of law, too, survived. Sumerian codes inspired rulers and governments for centuries. The idea that justice could be codified, that kings were accountable to the law, and that citizens had certain rights, became a cornerstone of civilization. These principles, born along the rivers of Mesopotamia, spread across empires, and shaped the development of human society for millennia. Even philosophy and spiritual thought were preserved. The Sumerians had asked the fundamental questions. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? How should we live in the face of mortality? Through myths, hymns, and epics, they explored the human condition, reflecting on ambition, grief, love, and devotion. These reflections continued to resonate long after their cities had vanished, inspiring future thinkers, poets, and sages. In the ruins of Sumer, the imagination of future generations wandered. Travelers and scholars gazed upon crumbling ziggurats and desolate canals, contemplating the people who had built them. What wisdom did they leave behind? What stories did the rivers carry? Even in decay, Sumer spoke to those who listened, whispering lessons about resilience, innovation, and the impermanence of power. Trade, too, bore the Sumerian mark. Even under new rulers, routes established by Sumerians remained in use. Goods and ideas traveled the same paths carved centuries earlier, connecting distant lands. Sumer had not only created cities, but networks. Connections that bound humanity together, enabling cultures to grow, exchange, and flourish. The legacy of Sumer is most vivid in memory and story. Epics like Gilgamesh traveled through time, teaching the inevitability of death, the value of friendship, and the pursuit of immortality through deeds and legacy. The stories of Inanna's descent, Enki's wisdom, and the gods' interactions with humans shaped the way later civilizations understood their own lives, blending morality, philosophy, and divine order. Even the ordinary Sumerian contributed to this enduring legacy. Every tablet pressed into clay, every canal dug, every hymn sung, every object crafted, all became part of a civilization that would live far beyond its own time. In their labor and devotion, Sumerians had built more than cities. They had built a foundation for all of human civilization. And so, when we look at the rivers, the ruins, the clay tablets, the ziggurats, or when we read the myths and laws left behind, we are touching the essence of Sumer. We are hearing the voice of the first civilization, whispering across 5,000 years, teaching us how to live, how to build, and how to endure. The Sumerians remind us that even when cities crumble, even when kings fall, and even when empires vanish, human ingenuity, creativity, and devotion can persist. Their story is one of beginnings, the beginnings of writing, law, trade, architecture, art, religion, and civilization itself. And in these beginnings, we find lessons that are still relevant, even in a world far removed from the rivers of Mesopotamia. The legacy of Sumer is eternal. It is written in the clay tablets, sung in the hymns, reflected in the stars, and carried by the rivers. It is the story of humanity learning to shape its world, to leave a mark, to create meaning. And through this story, the first civilization continues to live on, not in cities or empires, but in memory, knowledge, and the enduring spirit of human achievement.